Welcome to the Research Reimagined podcast, brought to you by Nottingham Trent University. I'm your host, Helen Darby-Dowman, and I'll be inviting some of NTU's brightest minds to explore how their research is helping us to deepen our understanding of the world. From online addictions to transgender rights and sleep disorders. Listen as we discuss some of society's most pressing challenges and uncover some of the ways our research is making a difference. Though American football has long been seen and thought of as a men's sport, women have been taking part for over 100 years, and in the US, more girls are playing than ever before. In 2015, Jennifer Welter became the first of several women to earn a coaching position in the professional game, with 15 women now mentoring teams on the field. There's been a number of successes in other areas of the sport too. In the US, an ESPN documentary featuring the most successful women's team in the country, the Boston Renegades, is streaming on Hulu, and the NFL highlighted its investment in women's football by showing a landmark Super Bowl commercial pledging its promise to invest in women's American football and its commitment to growing the women's game across the country. But what do these successes really mean? How far has women's American football got to go to match the men's professional game? In this episode, NTU's lecturer in Sociology of Sport, Dr. Katie Taylor, discusses gender equality in sport and provides an insight into the history of women's American football. Hi Katie, thanks so much for joining us today. Would you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a lecturer in Sociology of Sport, so I work in the Department of Sport and Exercise Science. I've been at NTU now for about 18 months. I've been really enjoying it since I've been here. So my research kind of really focuses on women's involvement in American football. So it started off mostly looking at it from a historical point of view, but now kind of looking at it from kind of contemporary points of view, media representation. And the reason I write about it is I'm actually a qualified American football coach for both contact and the non-contact version of the sport. And I used to be the team manager of the men's GB non-contact side as well. So that's where my interest in the sport has kind of come from, really.
Could you maybe just start by telling us a little bit about the history of American football?
Yeah, so the sport emerged from some dissatisfaction with rugby, I suppose. So rugby was being played across the US, but they found it a little bit boring. They didn't really understand the scrums. They're like, well, no one really wants to watch this. So it emerged from that. But the kind of really important thing is that it emerged at a time in the US when there was this kind of perceived crisis of masculinity. There was this idea that kind of middle-class men and especially college students were becoming a bit effeminate. And part of that is it was kind of a time when there was fewer places for them to demonstrate their manliness. They couldn't go off to the frontier and win the frontier. That was done. The Civil War was over. So essentially football became this kind of ultimate proving ground for young men to demonstrate their masculinity. So as such, it was quite important that the sport was fairly violent. There were deaths and things like that. But at no point did the deaths actually lead to a ban on the sport. It led to rule changes, like the forward pass, but never a ban. So the sport has kind of historically had this kind of crucial role to play in being a place for men to prove their masculinity, really.
And so obviously a lot of your research to do with women's participation in the sport. Can you give us a bit of the history of that and perhaps some of the impact that you've just described about it being very masculine and the impact that that's had on the history of the women's sport?
Yeah, so in terms of how long women have been playing it, everyone's kind of astonished to find out that kind of the earliest evidence goes back as far as the 1890s. And actually we see the very first attempt for there to be an actual competitive league emerges in San Francisco in 1897. But a lot of these really early matches that the women played were kind of informal. They kind of organised them themselves. They were actually acutely aware that it wasn't a sport that was necessarily supposed to be one that they were playing. So what they did in those early years is quite often amended the rules that they played to. So they'd play informally. They'd usually try and play away from male eyes. They would amend some of the rules to reduce some of the tackling because they kind of knew it wasn't necessarily appropriate. But yeah, so their participation goes back all that way. And then as time goes by, they kind of play in different ways. You get into the 1920s and you start to see actually some physical educators decide that women playing contact sport might be a good thing to introduce to their women. Now, it's only a handful of examples, but it's quite a significant change. But as time goes by, the non-contact version of the sport becomes more and more popular. You see physical educators being really encouraging of girls playing it because I think they see it as something different for them to play, something to engage those students who are perhaps less interested, let's say, in other forms of physical activity. And in the 1930s and 40s, you see more leagues emerge. There's one that emerges in Ohio, there's one that emerges in LA and one in Chicago. And these are largely entrepreneurs who are trying to perhaps take advantage of the fact it's a bit unusual to see women play American football, and they think it might be a way to make some money. But yeah, the whole... So women have been playing a long time. They've been playing contact version of sport from way back in the 1890s. But you're right that this idea that it's a real masculine sport causes a lot of problems. So like I said, so earlier in early years they amended the sport. The non-contact version became more popular, and you still see that today. So you still see that. So the NFL, the last Super Bowl, had this big advert showing women playing American football, but it was the non-contact version of the sport. And they're supporting the non-contact version in colleges as well. So what you see today is a legacy of this whole idea that the sport is very masculine, hyper-masculine, in that women now have to kind of play, or the accepted way that women play the sport is more of a non-contact version. But that doesn't mean there aren't women today playing the contact version.
At the minute then, if you were to look at the leagues that we see, is it very much the contact version is almost a little bit less visible? Is that what we're saying? As in we see the non-contact, but the contact sport happens, but it just isn't really publicised.
I think that's probably fair to say. So in the US, so we'll start with kind of the US context. There are thriving women's leagues. One in particular, Women's Football Alliance. I think when I last looked at their website, it had about 64 teams playing it kind of across different divisions. And they are getting more media coverage. Their national championship game, I think, was televised on ESPN, maybe on one of their internet channels, but ESPN covered it. And they are getting some media coverage. They're getting some sponsorship. But in terms of the public awareness, I don't think it's all that high. The NFL have clearly been promoting the flag version of the sport, the non-contact version. That was what the Super Bowl ad was all about. They're not really supporting the contact version of the game. So the flag one is the one that's really getting the kind of publicity. In this country, I think it's a little bit of both. You get... I think if you're following it in this country, you kind of have to go out of your way to find out about it, and then you'll probably know that both versions are fairly popular. There's a number of teams across the country for flag and for the contact version. But I would say that the flag version is probably a little bit more obvious to the wider public in the US.
So what are the problems then that this kind of perception, I suppose, of masculinity and femininity present itself for women within the sport, or those that actually want to participate?
The fact that the flag version is so popular means that a lot of women perhaps don't get the opportunity to take up the contact version. And part of the problem that kind of is associated with that is because it's not seen as a particularly feminine sport. It's not what kind of these gendered ideas about how women should behave or what sports they should take part in. I think there's a lack of awareness and lack of opportunity for women who want to play. So what you find is that some young women historically have tried to sue to get the opportunity to play the contact version of the sport. They haven't always been successful. But essentially there's no real setup, there's no real structure for young girls who want to play. Because the structure for boys is really clear. So they start in high school, probably before that as well. So pee-wee football, play at high school, then go to college, and then they're drafted into the pros. None of that really exists for young women. They usually have to, if they want to play, they have to play on boys' teams. And then that's really down to whether the coaches will accept them. So what you find with a lot of the women who do play is that they come to it a little bit later in life. So they come to it maybe in their 20s, 30s. There's a local team like Women's Football Alliance has got a team nearby, and they join that way. It's a big kind of lack of structure is one of the problems.
What is that impact having, I guess, on kind of we're obviously describing that not having those pathways is impacting the people coming into it. What is the wider impact in terms of the skill level, the kind of depth within the sport? I guess, we know American football's huge, particularly in the US, and everything that surrounds it. I mean, it's a big business. Like, how does that impact, I suppose, what I'm saying, the playing ability and all the way down to coaching and so forth into the women's game?
Yeah, so the women who play are inevitably going to, largely have a lower skill level. They're still really skilled, but they haven't been playing, perhaps, usually for as long as boys and young men have been playing. If there's a girl, so there have been some girls and young women who've made it onto collegiate teams who have managed to find, a boys' team that they were allowed to play on, and they've made it, and they play on collegiate teams. So in terms of the coaching that they're getting, they're getting the same as the boys, but these examples are so rare. You're talking like only a handful of examples. For the vast majority of women who are playing, they're playing in these. They call themselves semi-professional teams like the Women's Football Alliance, but they're largely players have to pay. There's not really a professional element in terms of the women getting paid. There's very little information on the kind of coaching staff that they get. But some of the women who've played in the WFA are now getting positions as coaches in the NFL. So there is, they're clearly the players themselves are being acknowledged for having good skill levels, for having good knowledge, and they are getting good positions in the NFL, which is great. There's a dozen or so starting this season who are coaching. But, these are rare examples. We are talking about only a handful. So we're talking about, women's football is a really minority sport in the US. They're joining it later. And then I touched on the professionalism a little bit, just to give some kind of idea. These women are quite often paying, $1,000, $2,000 a season to be able to play. And then when you compare that to this off season, the new highest paid player in the NFL is going to be Justin Herbert, the LA Chargers quarterback, and his contract's worth $52.2 million a year. But women are paying, a couple of $1,000s to be able to play the sport. So, that gives you an idea of the difference between the male game and the female game. It's very much a minority sport.
I mean, I was surprised when you mentioned earlier about the history and how long actually women have been playing it. And I guess still the development of the female game is very, very slow. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about how women's American football has changed over the years?
Obviously, there's two perspectives on this. There's the GB perspective and the US perspective. In terms of Great Britain, so like I said at the start, I was the former team manager for the men's GB non-contact side, the flag side. So that was, back in 2015 sort of time. So I was the manager for about 4 years. And while I was doing that, there was no female equivalent. There was no female GB flag team. And I was trying to write proposals for the NGB to try and get a team. So I'd write, this is not going to cost you very much. Like, we can share facilities, we can do all this. And they were like, no, there's not enough women playing. So a few of us went a little bit rogue, and we took some talented women over to Frankfurt in Germany for a tournament to give some of the most talented female flag players the chance. I'm not sure the NGB was very happy with us doing that, but it couldn't really stop us. But a few years later, they actually did agree to have a women's team. And then I was at the first trials for that women's team. And it was incredible. There must have been about 60, 70 women turned up. I was like, you can't say that, there aren't enough women playing it. And they've gone on to do really good things. So they've got actually their European Championships is coming up towards the end of August. But their last Euros, they came second, which was amazing. And there's more and more women playing the non-contact game. There are specific non-contact teams for women, and they're actually able to play alongside men in the National League as well. In terms of the contact team, there's been a league for women since about 2012, and it's been slowly getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they play the standard 11 versus 11 format. We have a GB women's team, They most recently came second in the World Championship, only losing to the Americans. So that was really good. And obviously we've got also some phenomenal role models. So Phoebe Schechter, who plays for GB Contact and GB Flag, she's a Sky Sports pundit, so she does the NFL coverage on Sky. She's had a coaching internship with the Buffalo Bills. So the sport is growing. Definitely, there's more and more women playing both versions of the sport in the UK. And they're getting the support of a governing body now, which they weren't necessarily before. In the US, it's kind of been hit and miss. So my research, so I've got a book under contract. So my research kind of goes up to the 1960s, but there's some really good books about the women's league that started in the 1970s. So there was the National Women's Football League, and that had teams in Toledo and in Los Angeles. But that kind of didn't really get off the ground. They struggled to kind of get people to go and watch. They struggled with any kind of sponsorship, and that kind of folded in the 80s. So then in the 2000s, you start to get more leagues kind of start to form. Some kind of flounder and disappear quite quickly. And then you've got things like the Women's Football Alliance that, like I said, they've got 64 teams. There is another one. There's the Women's National Football Conference. They have about 16 teams. So that is kind of growing. I think it's over the past few years it has stayed around 60-odd teams in the Women's Football Alliance. But like I said, they're getting a bit more sponsorship, a bit more media coverage. And obviously the big thing is now that the NFL is basically partnering with the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics, and they've made flag football a collegiate sport for women. So it's actually a sport that is officially recognised sport that women can play. There's competitions, and the NFL has supported that, and they've supported it with financial incentives to the teams that kind of sign up. So it is growing, and there are more opportunities, but it's very, very much a minority sport.
We talk a lot about, obviously, the flag game. Is that because females, from your research, is it because females want to play the non-contact version, or is it more to do with the fact that we don't see the contact sport as much?
There very may well be reasons associated with concerns over injury. And no one has done any research really on, why is it that flag is perhaps a more popular game for women. But I think that issues to do with concussion, they're ever present. We know more and more about how dangerous the sport is. So I think that might have something to do with it. But I think actually that, again, this goes back to kind of this history that the sport is hyper-masculine, that it's all about kind of aggression and strength and all those characteristics that, society has told us for years that women are not supposed to demonstrate, they're not appropriate for women to play these sports. So I think what we've got is that flag football tends to be on offer more for women because that's the expectation of that's more appropriate for women to play. And, it comes down to kind of these paternalistic attitudes, really. And you see it in various bits of research. So you see Dunia Antunovic has done some research on the first woman who officiated an NFL game. And when, you look at her research and the comments about Shannon Easton, who's the woman who officiated, but the comments on articles are all about, she might get hurt by standing on the sidelines. And then when you look at research or look at articles about women who've played perhaps in the collegiate game, again, the message boards are, but she might get hurt. She might, how can she protect herself? So I think a lot of the reasons why we have flag as being offered more to women is because this historical association with sport, but also this kind of paternalism that we need to protect women from being harmed because they're obviously too fragile to be able to participate.
It certainly sets up a lot of barriers, doesn't it? A lot of challenges for females to get involved. And I suppose when you're talking about it from an officiating point of view, and I suppose that then maybe leads into let's talk a little bit about Dr. Jenny Welter, who became the first woman to coach in the NFL. I mean, can you tell me a bit about what a historic moment that was in American football? And how did people actually respond to having, a female coach?
Yeah, it was a massive moment. I mean, women have historically been coaching American football for a long, long time. I've had an article on that and a piece in the Washington Post. So women have actually been coaching American football since the 1880s. And especially in times of war, men went to war and women, traditionally took over a lot of the roles that men had to do, and that included as football coaches. And the media were pretty positive about them. With Jen Welter's, her appointment was massive because no one had done it in the professional leagues. There was worldwide interest. This wasn't just like a US story. This was a worldwide story. And the articles generally were very, very positive. So I'm kind of in the middle of a research project around this, but a lot of the articles mentioned her previous playing experience. She'd actually played in a men's professional league. It's kind of like an indoor league, but yeah, she played alongside men. She'd coached men in the past as part of that in that same league. They mentioned her gold medals that she'd won as part of Team USA. And they mentioned her educational background, her MA, her PhD, things like that, which is great. They're really positive about it. But this need to kind of constantly reassure everyone that she was perfectly qualified to do it, speaks to kind of some of the issues that female coaches face in that they constantly have to prove themselves. They constantly have to be better than men. There's a lot of research that indicates that. So it was great coverage. But you kind of, when you read between the lines, you think, actually, they need to reassure people that, it's okay. There were some negative reactions. There was an E! News article that, rather than focus on the great achievement, decided to focus on this is what everyone's saying about it, and kind of focused on the kind of sexist, misogynistic comments that were being made on message boards about it. And there was one other article worth mentioning, which is Cosmopolitan wrote a piece about it, and I've written down the quote so I didn't forget it. And they basically called it a Cinderella story, but that she was transformed, and there's a quote, in a football uniform, helmet and cleats, not a gown, a crown and heels, was how they phrased it. I was like, I get what you're trying to do, but let's not conjure the Cinderella image. It's not
helpful.
No. So the vast majority of the reaction was great, but there's always going to be those kind of sexist comments and misogynistic comments that you get as well.
And what do you think the impact was for the public and for other females within the sport? I mean, what have we seen? Have we seen change since that time in 2015?
Yeah, so we're getting more and more female coaches in the NFL with every passing year. So Sam Rappaport, she's I forget her title. I think she's a senior director for diversity, equality, and inclusion. So what she now runs, and the NFL run, is a women's forum, and they do this every year, and they get women who've coached perhaps in collegiate levels or have played to high levels. They get them together and they get them to network with team owners, managers, coaches from the NFL, and the idea is that they get the knowledge on how to make it in the NFL. So a lot of the women who've attended that are now coaching in the NFL. And then we had Katie Sowers, who became the first female to coach in a Super Bowl. And then more recently, what's the name? Laurie Locust, who coaches with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, has won a Super Bowl as a female coach, which is amazing. I've not kind of specifically looked at whether there's more and more women going into it, but it can only act as a really great role model. And again, I think Phoebe Schechter being there on Sky Sports from a UK perspective, as someone who's coached in the NFL as an intern, more and more women will be able to see that it is something they can do. Because when I was the team manager for the GB men's side, I felt like an oddity. I was mistaken for being the head coach's wife at least at one European tournament. So I felt like I was odd. But now, hopefully, these role models will show women that actually it's fine. And women have been coaching the sport for decades. It is a space for me.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that, because that was one of my thoughts coming to mind. Like, what were the challenges that you experienced yourself as a female coach of a male game?
Yeah, it was certainly an interesting time. I basically joined the team initially and kind of just really assisting them and helping them. And I went to a European Championships in that capacity, kind of filming games. And also I had a sports massage qualification, so I could, help prepare the players a little bit. At that first European Championships, there was there was an incident where we were kind of going out in the evening. There was someone in the squad. So the squad's made up of players and then there's associated people. We were going out in the evening, I had a skirt on, and they took a picture of my legs, and then they went, "Oh, that'll keep me warm tonight." And I was so new to the squad that I was like, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't kind of make a fuss out of it. No one stood up for me. And the squad were genuinely brilliant, but I think it was just kind of brushed off as a bit of banter, which it probably shouldn't have been. And like I said, I was mistaken for being the head coach's wife at an event, one of the Europeans. And I did have some difficulties at time getting the senior management in the NGB to kind of recognise me. I think someone actually emailed, "I don't recognise her as the team manager." I was like, well, I've been appointed by the head coach. So there were some struggles, but generally it was a really positive experience. I did really enjoy it. The players were brilliant. I wasn't made to feel like I was any different to any other member of the team, which was great. But I suspect stories like mine are, there's always going to be those little incidences that women have faced that they probably kind of just brush under the carpet as, it's part of just putting up with being in a male space. But for the most part, I really enjoyed it. I only really stopped doing it because I was too busy with work and doing a master's. So
obviously the sport is, as we've just chatted about, really has progressed massively, and with those kind of big figures female figures within the NFL and coaching and so forth, obviously we have seen increased exposure of females within the game, more people playing. But what further improvements do you think the women's game needs?
In the UK, I think having more women in senior levels in the sport can only be a good thing. When you look at the NGB's website and look at the makeup of the board, only 2 of the board members are female. The rest are male. Now the chair is female, so that's great, but a bit more diversity on the board might be good. And I think encouraging more women and girls to play and get involved in coaching, especially, I was having a conversation with a colleague yesterday about the benefits of having female coaches and seeing things differently and approaching things perhaps in a different way. And I think then there'll be more role models. Obviously, like I say, we've got Phoebe Schechter, but we need kind of more role models, more women kind of in really high levels being seen by the public. In the US, I think there are arguments for more support from the NFL to support the women's contact game. Now, obviously, that comes with advantages that there'd be financial backing, there would be, sponsorship, more media coverage. But then there's a downside of, do women want to give away control of their sport to men? Because, research by folks like Raf Nicholson will say, actually, once men start taking charge of women's sport, that's not always a good thing. But I think a structured route to the top for women is needed. More high school teams or community teams or something like that. So there's a pathway, because there's no pathway for women at all. So having that kind of structure, having perhaps one unified league. At the moment, the WFA is the dominant one, but there are 2. So a unified league that perhaps has more media coverage would help.
And do we think that we want equality in the sport, or is that actually? I mean, we kind of just brushed a little bit on that about, do we want the men? If the NFL took more control, then actually does it give the women less control of the sport? What's your opinion on that?
In an ideal world, equality is always, going to be a good thing. I do worry that if the NFL took it over, that it might be very changed. That again, the NFL are clearly more interested in flag. So if they did get involved with the contact side, would they try and water it down? Would they try and take over? But the other thing with equality in American football, you can't really ever escape the fact that it's a highly violent sport. And the question is actually, should anyone really be playing it? Given what we know about kind of concussions, they're not being treated as well as they could be. So do we want to encourage more women to be playing the contact version of it? Should we be encouraging anyone, boys, young men, whatever, to be playing a sport that is this violent? And certainly, the root of the sport with its masculinity, and this manliness embedded, woven into every kind of fabric of the sport. I don't think the NFL are going to change the way that the sport is, which is the one thing that they could do. So it's going to remain a highly violent sport. So equality, do we want to be encouraging women to be involved in the sport we know is going to have long-term health effects? So there's a big ethical issue with it all as well.
I mean, that is quite interesting. I was going to ask you about the flag aspect for the men's game, because I suppose that is a very clear difference, isn't it? As in the NFL are interested in flag game for the women or promoting that. But do we actually see much about the flag game in men's?
In the US, it's funny you should say this, because actually in the US, they've always had this event called the Pro Bowl. And the Pro Bowl it's like an all-stars game, essentially. So all the best players from the AFC and the NFC, the two kind of major leagues, get selected and they play this match. Now, traditionally, it's happened either the week before the Super Bowl or the week after the Super Bowl. And it's a full contact match. I mean, they tend to scale it back a little bit because it's the end of the season and no one wants to get hurt. But it's still, full of tackles and everything else. But this past season, they trialled something different, where they made it a bit more of a skills test. So the same way players were still selected and voted for onto these all-star teams. But then they had skills tests, like for the kickers, a kicking test, or for quarterbacks, an accuracy test. And then they played flag games. So they had the NFL players playing flag games instead of this full contact version. So it is becoming a little bit more kind of known to the public, I suppose. The NFL are promoting it. Now, part of it, I think, was due to concerns that, the Pro Bowl was not getting very high ratings. There's potential for harm. So the NFL are doing more to promote men playing flag, but not probably as like proper competitive leagues. And in a way, I think the Pro Bowl was probably seen as a bit of a laugh, it's a bit of a joke. Look at these guys playing flag, which is probably not the message, but it's been a bit more promoted, but you don't hear much about it really.
I mean, it's like what you said, I suppose, the question before this last one, really, where actually it's a hypermasculine sport. They don't want to change that. That's what it's been historically, and I suppose that's what viewers are wanting to see.
Absolutely. Whenever there are changes to rules that are designed to protect players, then there's usually an outcry from some individuals going, "Oh, we're just making it into into a girl sport or a sissy sport." You get all these kinds of phrases bandied about. So there are some fans who are always going to get upset if anything is done to reduce the kind of violence and the number of people getting concussed, because some people just, that's what they want to see. And that is a minority, but it's a quite vocal minority. That I think the NFL will be worried about losing too many people watching it if they sanitise the sport too much.
So if you could just sum up for us, I suppose, finally, are we in a good place for female American or women's American football?
It's getting better. It is getting better. It's nice to see that the WFA getting significant sponsorship deals. It's good that they're getting more media coverage. And from the GB perspective, loads and loads more girls are playing it. I used to coach in a sixth form college as well. I used to get girls joining the team. So it's getting better. It's not there yet. We definitely need more women coaches. And it's hard because it's a voluntary activity. It takes up a lot of time. But the more women we can get into kind of coaching, into high profile positions, that would be even better. So it's still a minority sport, but it's getting better.
Katie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
If you'd like to find out more about Katie's research, please have a look in the episode description. You've been listening to the Research Reimagined podcast by Nottingham Trent University. For all of the latest news from the research community at NTU, follow us on Twitter at NTU_research or sign up to our research newsletter by visiting ntu.ac.uk/research. Thanks for listening.